You're listening to episode 147 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness teachers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Elizabeth A. Stanley joins us to speak about her new book, Widen the Window, Training Your Brain and Body to Thrive During Stress and Recover from Trauma. As mindfulness grows in popularity and availability, there comes a widening of needs that it might meet. With more people trying it also comes the inevitability that more people doing so will have a history of trauma in their lives. While mindfulness practice may be helpful for those with traumatic experiences, it does need to be the right time for someone to participate in a program. The teacher needs to not just be adequately trained, but have their own long-standing practice, as well as an understanding of how to best work with those with a history of trauma. Today's guest knows this territory well. Elizabeth A. Stanley, Ph.D., is an associate professor of security studies at Georgetown University. She is the creator of the mindfulness-based Mind Fitness Training, or MFIT, taught to thousands in civilian and military high-stress environments. MFIT research has been featured on 60 Minutes, ABC Evening News, NPR, and in Time Magazine and many other media outlets. An award-winning author and U.S. Army veteran with service in Asia and Europe, she holds degrees from Yale, Harvard, and MIT. She's also a certified practitioner of somatic experiencing, a body-based trauma therapy. Our guest today is Elizabeth Stanley. Liz, welcome to the podcast. So glad to be speaking with you. I've wanted to have this conversation for years. Thanks for being here.
Ted, thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure and joy to be here.
So for those who are listening to this, I just want to share on a personal note, I'm very happy to have Liz with us because we met many, many years ago on we won't say how many, on retreat at Bhavana Society with Bhante Gunaratana, whom many of you may know from his books, Mindfulness in Plain English, for example, which is just a wonderful book, and he's a wonderful teacher, and it was a great opportunity to meet you there and to stay connected over time. So again, thanks for being here. And I'd like for the audience to hear from you about your background. Why don't you take some time and tell us about that?
Thanks again, Ted, for having me. I'm just so glad to be able to see you and have a chance to connect again. So I come from a long warrior lineage. There's been a Stanley serving in the U.S. Army every generation since the Revolutionary War. And I am the first female Stanley in this lineage. But coming from a long warrior lineage often also means coming from a long lineage of intergenerational trauma. And in my case, it's both my grandfather and my father saw combat. My grandfather was in World War II and the Korean War. My father fought in Vietnam. And I was born shortly after he got back to the States when he and my mother moved to West Point, where he was going to be teaching. And grew up as an Army brat and moved all over. 10 times I moved before I started college. But coming from this long lineage of intergenerational trauma, I had a number of challenging experiences during my childhood. shock trauma events and other challenges, so that by the time I served myself, I did an ROTC scholarship in college, and then I was on active duty as an intelligence officer. I was in Korea, and then I served in Germany and did 2 deployments in the Balkans. And coming from this long history of stress and trauma, and then lots of chronic stress with all of my work in the military, I had a near-death experience in Bosnia. My physical health really took a toll from all of this many years of chronic stress that I had been suppressing, as many of us have been conditioned to do. And it was when I finally got to graduate school that my system was just done. And in some ways, the book that I've recently written that we're going to talk about later on, which lays out a lot of the science behind our neurobiology in stress and trauma and resilience, my body and mind were in some ways exhibit A of what I wanted to eventually do. And my window of tolerance for stress arousal was wired during my early childhood experiences and my early social environment, was narrowed through many different stressful and traumatic experiences. It was narrowed further through all of these choices to keep pushing, to override physical pain and emotions and power through, as is so deeply conditioned in our culture. And eventually, there were symptoms of dysregulation that resulted, mental symptoms, cognitive symptoms, emotional symptoms, and a lot of physical symptoms. And I think the nadir of it all was when I lost my eyesight. But I had come to practice before that point. In some ways, I lost my eyesight. I'd been practicing at that point, I guess, 3 years. But I initially came to practice through yoga. One of my neighbors was a yoga teacher, and I started initially just with Shavasana, that period of time where you are at the end of practice when you are laying there in the corpse pose. And then I had an egg timer, and I was practicing a couple minutes a day. And my mind was racing and all kinds of intensification of symptoms. But I stuck with it. And my first week-long retreat was in 2003. My first retreat was a metta retreat, in fact, which in retrospect, I realize now was a very wise choice. Metta practice is all about cultivating loving kindness for yourself and for others. And the first day on that retreat just felt like so long. And by the end of the day, I was like, I don't think I can do this anymore. And I did a second day, and it was just as hard. And by the second evening, I was like, I really don't know if I can do this any longer. And as I was lying there in bed, I started crying. It had been such a challenging day, being constantly with my experience and being so dysregulated, having so many symptoms. I was suffering from PTSD and depression at the time. I'm lying in my bed crying, and I told myself, if it's still this bad tomorrow, I give myself permission to quit at lunchtime. And, as often is the case, when you kind of give over to your experience like that, the next morning I woke up and things were much calmer and more settled, and I really settled into the retreat and eventually didn't want to go home. But it took many years later on that I looked back and realized that moment, lying in bed and giving myself permission to quit, that was the first fruit of this practice of loving kindness for myself. I had spent my whole life pushing and pushing and pushing. I had never let myself quit. I was so identified with not being a quitter. And just that first fruit of the practice to see, no, it's okay. I can care for myself in that way was the beginning of, now 2 decades of practice. But many long retreats. I spent some time, as you know, in Burma as a nun. And I think practice is an important part of my life and an important part of being able to live with presence and self-regulation in the world. And from this very long journey that I feel like I have rambled on about.
I told you you'd feel that way.
Indeed. I realized that, I was in this process of healing my own trauma and came to this and then came to a variety of therapies and came to my own clinical training very much to help save myself. But parallel to that, I was in the midst of training to become a professor who teaches about international security, like that's the day job. Yeah. And in that day job, I was really interested in why we were so reliant, in fact, over-reliant on technology for the ways that we feel safe in the world. And I began to look at all of the imbalances that this kind of addiction to technology had for security purposes, and realize that it causes us to lean forward in a very anticipatory stance. We really want to predict and prevent unwanted things from happening. The truth is we can't predict and prevent every unwanted thing from happening. And so I got very interested in resilience as a balance to this anticipation. And I wanted to test the hypothesis, can we train resilience? If we've spent all this time, we've invested all this money and effort in building these technological systems to anticipate, and they're never going to be foolproof, what do we do when things don't live up to the plan? How do we respond then? And how can we have a resilient stance to live with that, to learn and adapt when things don't go according to plan? And so this kind of personal path plus this very intellectual interest led me together to create a mindfulness-based resilience program and to test it among people in the national security community to see, is it possible to train someone to be resilient? And that was the initial fruit, the seed of mindfulness-based mind fitness training, MFIT. And my first collaborator was Amishi Jha, who I know has been on the show with you. And we've collaborated after some studies with Amishi, collaborated with another team of scientists on the West Coast for several studies with the Marines. And the data are pretty clear. It is possible to train oneself with consistent practices to become more resilient. And so the book that I am just sharing with the world right now is kind of a culmination of all of these pieces. My own healing journey, stories from the thousands of men and women I've trained and their healing journeys, backed by a lot of science, not just our experimental studies in the military setting, but also by a range of other empirical research about stress, trauma, abuse, resilience. And it's all come together in Widen the Window, and I'm very happy to be sharing it with the world.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for telling us about your story and that personal sharing as well, because I knew that your background had some very interesting aspects to it that contributed to how you've learned and grown. And I'm wondering if, from looking back on your own personal history, both in the military and then the stresses that you had and the experiences that you went through, that helped with your connection with other fellows in military service, people that you served with, and how this influenced your understanding of how people meet severe stress. Even before there was formal training, what did you notice? What were some things that stood out for you about how people are in these extreme stress situations?
It's a great question, Ted. There are, we each learn our own conditioned responses for how we cope with stress and trauma early in our life. Our window of tolerance to stress arousal starts being wired while we're still in the womb. And it's very influenced, especially in our early childhood. But it continues to be conditioned throughout our life, in our educational environments, in our work environments, in our socialization, in our communities, and especially in modern American culture. This isn't even just extreme stress environments like preparing for combat. Just modern American culture is very deeply conditioned towards strategies that help our thinking brains feel a little bit more in control, but that are not actually getting at the things that we need to be doing for true recovery. And so we tend to be turning stress on and never turning it off. And then we are coping with a variety of different strategies, sometimes substances, to manage all of this arousal and to kind of keep pushing. And some of this, and I write about it in the book, comes out as mixed messaging, society-wide mixed messaging. The ways that we say we want life balance, we want, and relationships are important, health is important, but then we're making choices day to day in our workplaces, in our families, in our schools that are not aligned with true balance and health. And in the course of doing that, we end up disconnecting stress from its consequences and disowning the trauma and the stress in the meantime. In extreme stress settings, there is a real habit towards what I call thinking brain override, where we compartmentalize the challenging experience, where we suppress our physical pain and our emotions, and where we override our bodies and our mind's limits to keep pushing. And in the military, they sometimes call this "suck it up and drive on." That's the name of that strategy. But powering through is another way of talking about it. And when we do that, often the stress arousal and the resulting dysregulation that occurs comes out sideways in physical illnesses. In the scientific literature, this is called somatization, and it's extremely common in high stress environments. It's socialized. We still have some amount of stigma that makes it a little more okay to seek help for physical conditions, maybe than for psychological or mental or emotional ones. And, suck it up and drive on is extremely adaptive in life or death situations.
Right.
But many of us have socialized it as our habitual response to day-to-day life. And that's not so adaptive.
Yeah, they're very good tactic, not so good strategy as a long adaptation.
Yeah, it has long-term consequences that are dark, I think, sometimes.
One of the things you mentioned was the MFIT program. I'm wondering if you could describe what that is a little bit for those who might not have heard of that before.
Sure. MFIT is a program that I developed that draws from three lineages. The skills training involved draws from mindfulness training and from body-based trauma therapies and some of the techniques for re-regulating the survival brain and nervous system after we've had prolonged stress exposure or trauma exposure. But I very consciously also situated MFIT within the lineage of the warrior traditions. There have been millennia of warrior traditions in lots of different cultures that have had as their goal to really build the adaptive capacity in warriors that were going to defend their communities, so that they would be able to keep their thinking brain capacity online even during extreme stress situations, so that they could access ethical and effective decisions, even when shit was hitting the fan, pardon my language. So MFIT kind of draws from these three lineages. The first module focuses on the warrior traditions specifically, and two qualities that are common across all the warrior traditions, that all the warrior traditions focus on cultivating. And those are wisdom and courage. And, with mindfulness training, we can build kind of moment to moment wisdom and courage in our minds and bodies. Moment to moment, wisdom is the ability to see things clearly, just as they are right now. And courage is the ability to allow them to be that way without needing them to be different. And if we can have both of those things present, it opens the possibility for choice. And ultimately, MFIT aims to build agency, even in high stress situations, because when our survival brain doesn't feel like we have agency, to say that opposite, if our survival brain is perceiving us to be helpless or powerless or lacking control in a stressful situation, that is the recipe for trauma. And so the goal was to help train people to keep these capacities online so that even in extreme stress situations, they will not end up will be less likely to end up experiencing traumatic stress. So it's a blend of understanding of the neurobiology of stress, trauma, and resilience so that thinking brains can understand why you're practicing certain exercises. And then it's body-based skills training, both mindfulness training and self-regulation skills training.
So one thing you've mentioned a couple of times here, and I was making a guess as I was preparing for tonight's conversation, the title of your book is Widen the Window. As I saw that, I was wondering, and the word in the subtitle, Training Your Brain and Body to Thrive During Stress and Recovering from Trauma, I'm like, I'm wondering if that was a reference. And you've used this phrase a couple of times tonight, the window of tolerance. And I'm wondering if you might describe what that is.
Yes. So the window is the window of tolerance to stress arousal that each of us have. It's a neurobiological window. It's one of our mind body's limits, actually. And when we're inside our window, our thinking brain with our conscious reasoning and decision making, as well as our survival brain, which controls automatic and rapid controlling stress and emotions, those two parts of the brain can work together in a cooperative way when we're inside our window. When we're inside our window, we can keep our thinking brain skills online when we are going through stress, can function effectively. We can continue to maintain connections with others and both offer and receive support. We have more tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity. We are not as rattled when plans get disrupted, and we have more ability to flex and flow adaptively with the change in plans. We experience less stress around change and uncertainty. And when we're inside our window, we're also in the stance to help set us up for full recovery so that our minds and bodies can come back to the necessary baseline where we can do some of the things that get put on the longer term projects like growth and digestion that get put on hold when we are under stress. So everyone has a window. Everyone's window is wired through our experiences, repeated experiences. We start wiring our window when we're still in the womb. It is very influenced by our early childhood and our early care provider relationship. And then in the book, I lay out how the window can be narrowed over time. I lay out 3 pathways: childhood adversity, shock trauma events, and everyday chronic stress and relational trauma that many, many thinking brains write off as no big deal, but that actually can have quite a material effect on narrowing our window. But this is not just a bad news story. Even narrow windows can become wide or widened. And in this way, I'm Exhibit A too. Like, I had a very narrow window when I was suffering in my 20s. And it can be widened through a variety of different habits. And I lay out some of those in the third part of the book. So when we're outside our window, that's when we're more likely to be overriding our limits, to be suppressing our pain and not really dealing with it, to be making reactive or impulsive decisions that are being driven by stress and emotion. And when we're outside our window, that's when we're also more likely to rely very heavily on stress reaction cycle coping habits. These are things that help us feel good or feel soothed in the short term, but aren't actually helping us fully recover. So we're adding to our stress load. And there are lots of examples of stress reaction cycle habits on steroids in our culture right now.
And as I get this sense just from speaking with you, knowing from your work, is you have this progress path that people can move from a sense of overwhelm to confident resilience. There are many different conditions that may contribute to that over time, and they're going to vary in doses and frequency for individuals, of course. But I'm wondering if, and perhaps you mentioned this in the book, maybe you can describe some of the parts of the book as well. What's some of those conditions in your experience that can help someone moving in that direction of health and resilience?
That's a good question. I think I want to take a slight tangent and pick up on a word you said in your question, and that was the word path. I think it's really important to think about this as a path. We are collectively, as a culture, very impatient, very desiring of silver bullets and pill form solutions, and very interested in the lowest possible dose, the fastest possible thing we can have to feel better right now. That's very common in our culture. And I will freely admit, when I was actively suffering from PTSD, I had this very misguided misconception that there was going to be one big cathartic moment, one big cathartic healing, and then it was going to all be better. And that's just not true. That's not how we are wired as minds and bodies. Just like it takes us almost 3 decades for our minds and bodies to fully wire as humans. Our neurobiological development continues into our early 30s. And it's very malleable to the repeated experiences we're having in our social environment throughout that time. All of those repeated experiences together are having influence on our neurobiological structure, on our immune system, even down to a cellular level in terms of genetic expression, which genes have expressed or not, the idea of epigenetics. And science is really exploring that right now. It's very exciting. So just as it takes us that long to kind of create these structures, we need to have some amount of patience with the path that moving towards qualities, perfecting virtuous qualities of wisdom, of courage, of compassion. These are practices that we can practice and really fine-tune over time. But at the material level of minds and bodies, it's the repeated experiences over and over that incline these structures in a new direction. And for many of us, we're not really aware of how much these often unconscious habits that are happening day in and day out are having tremendous effects on setting the trajectory for our health or our lack of health. And so each day is a choice. Actually, each day has lots and lots of moments of choice. And there are lots of habits that we can cultivate, not just with mindfulness. There are other habits we can cultivate too, that by making those choices in a repeated way, we can really begin to influence the width of our window. So a narrow window is not destined to stay narrow if someone makes choices to incline in a different way. But it's also important to recognize a wide window doesn't get a free pass to automatically be wide either. We are responsible. And that's where the idea of agency is so important. And I really play on this interplay of structure and agency in the book. When I was suffering and had lost my eyesight and had really bad lung problems and was coping with insomnia and awful flashbacks and all of the other things that came with being depressed and having PTSD and Lyme disease that no one knew was Lyme disease and all of these other things, that was a particular structure. And I couldn't just wave a magic wand and do one day of practice and hope it was going to be different. It takes a while for the mind and body to restructure themselves. Maybe that was a longer answer than you wanted.
That's a wonderful answer. And that's just on the path part. Now I want to hear about structure in the book.
So the book is set up around 3 parts. The first part I call Life on the Gerbil Wheel, which is really... the book had 2 goals. One was to share the path that I learned from my own experience and from training thousands of other people, so that other people could follow this path too. But the other goal of my book was to really engage readers on a wider reflection about how we as a culture engage with or don't engage with stress, trauma, and resilience. And so the first part of the book, part 1, is really looking at some of these cultural norms and habits and beliefs that many of us have been socialized into and are not even fully conscious of, that can really impede our ability to recover and can exacerbate our symptoms. And I survey all of the ways that resilience today in America is very, very undermined collectively. I mean, we are, as a culture, suffering quite a great deal. And I highlight that there's lots of different flavors to that. It doesn't have one particular profile. I share my story, which is one profile, but I also share many other stories to help people see that there are lots of profiles, different ways that narrow windows show up. And in the first part, I really highlight how much it's wonderful that we as humans have these thinking brains, so that we can reason and cooperate. We have language, we can plan, but sometimes our thinking brains kind of get in the way. And one of the biggest ways they get in the way is that whether we have stress arousal or not is not up to our thinking brain. That is a survival brain task called neuroception. And whether or not we recover after stress or trauma is, again, not a thinking brain job. It's up to the survival brain. Survival brain controls recovery. And so if we're not setting the conditions for our survival brain to feel safe, we're never going to be able to turn our stress off and have the full recovery that we need to build our resilience. So that's part one, sort of setting that up. Part two looks at the science behind the window, and it explores both the brain and the body during stress and trauma, what that's really like. It explores neuroplasticity and epigenetics, and then it explores the ways that the window can get narrowed and what happens when we have a narrow window, how symptoms of dysregulation show up in our minds and bodies. And then, not to leave readers in this horrible place of, oh my goodness, I have a narrow window, and what do I now do? Part three is really looking at ways to widen the window. And I've had several people say to me, why did you put all that science in there? I promise it's got lots of stories, so it's hopefully accessible science. But when I was having so many symptoms myself and beginning to learn the science, I found the science extremely liberating because it finally gave my thinking brain understanding for why my body was acting the way it was, why I was choosing to cope in certain ways, why I was responding in certain ways in certain situations. And, I felt tremendous amounts of shame and self-judgment around some of my coping habits, around some of my symptoms, and understanding that these were neurobiological processes at work that had been wired long before. They were not under my control, that this was just conditioning playing out. That was so liberating for me. And I have found in teaching others, when they can understand what's going on, it both helps them not take it so personally. It cuts down on that shame and self-judgment. But even more, it helps to create the motivation for why they would choose to pick other habits and do things differently. So all of that is to set up part three, which has 8 chapters that look at lots of different ways that we can find agency during stress. At the micro level in our bodies, like when we're dealing with intense emotions or chronic pain. At a macro level, in the ways that we relate to the sense of time scarcity in our life, or uncertainty or change, the way that we choose to relate to limits, our body's limits, our mind limits. There's a lot of cultural conditioning around that too. So part 3 is not the MFIT course, although it includes several of the MFIT practices, but it goes beyond the MFIT course to continue this wider reflection that I wanted to engage readers with. And the last chapter of the book kind of takes it out a step wider to look at the collective window. And in that chapter, I really take on some of the science that's come out in the last 15 years about the different mechanisms by which we are wired to connect. We're not separate. Our initial wiring isn't up to us. It's very much influenced by our social environment. And in the last chapter, I kind of turn that on its head and look at how what's going on in our mind and body is resonating out to the world around us. and look at how stress and emotion contagion work, and especially kind of the obligations that teachers and bosses and therapists and parents and leaders have in terms of their own presence and self-regulation and what that is, the effect it's having on the people around them.
So it's so interesting to hear you speak in this way about stress and emotion contagion. And I want to give you the opportunity to say a little bit more about that in particular, because what I often hear from critics of mindfulness programs is they continuously characterize it as selfish, as just being about you and your own personal experience internally in the moment. And of course, that's not how you or I or anyone I have ever encountered ever teaches mindfulness. But that's one of the mindfulness people's favorite stories. So I want you to say a little bit more about what you were saying, which is, again, in direct contrast to what they're saying, especially around stress and emotion contagion.
Yes. I think there is maybe a simplistic truth in their point, which is that many people are initially drawn to practice because they are suffering in some way, and they are looking to feel better. I certainly was initially drawn to practice for that reason. Many of the other people I've trained have been in that situation as well. I think, though, that if you don't acknowledge how stress and emotion contagion work, that can look like it's kind of very self-centered. And if your only reason for practicing is to feel better, that goal can actually, ironically, make our stress worse. Because when we're in that particular attitude and mindset of, I'm doing this for this particular outcome, we are at the same time as we're having that goal, holding a stance that is telling our survival brain that the way it is right now is not okay. And that actually is a stressful thing for the survival brain. So it can make it worse. So I think we have to hold any goals very loosely. The commitment needs to be to the path, not to a particular outcome. But that said, when someone has practiced and has learned to be able to tolerate discomfort in their mind and body, to tolerate discomfort in their environment, to work skillfully with their intense emotions or their own physical pain or their own unskillful behaviors in the way they relate to other people, they're going to be much more likely to be in a regulated place where they can then help to diffuse the stress and emotion kind of positive feedback loop that's often out there of the contagion. When we are stressed, our minds and bodies are creating stress arousal. And when we are in contact with other people, when we're in that state, when we're agitated, when we're anxious, when we're irritated, when we're stressed and overwhelmed, if we're physically in contact with someone else, especially if it's someone that we have an attachment relationship with, a parent, a child, a romantic partner, that other person is picking up on that arousal in us. And it is mirrored then, their survival brain finds that to be challenging, and that then mirrors it in them. And so it becomes this positive feedback loop between the people, that it goes back and forth, and they can continue to get each other more and more activated. It's one of the reasons why sitting in a traffic jam is so uncomfortable. You're surrounded by all of these irritated and impatient and unhappy people, and you're all ricocheting off each other. So if you're with someone who's very aroused that way, who's very activated, if you can hold your own presence and self-regulation in front of that, you can actually resonate the presence and self-regulation to them that can help calm their survival brain down. It's something that skilled therapists use all the time. Skilled teachers can use in their classrooms when their students are completely, restless and activated. And this is a way that we can just be embodying our practice without needing to actually teach. You can just be embodying it, and you are helping to move the world towards a more regulated place. In any moment, we're either contributing regulation or we're contributing dysregulation. And it's very, very contagious both ways.
Yeah, it's that teaching is not always an explicit didactic. that it is how we
No.
are, which is why it's foundationally based on having our own deep practice.
Yes.
So there are just two other things I wanted to ask about, and I want to save the teaser about your next book for last. So I got one thing before that, and that is that almost every day I see critics of mindfulness for people in military service repeating a single myth. There's nothing else they have to say about it, just a single myth: mindful snipers. And their narrative is usually packed full of images of people in camo with big guns, and then they contrast that with a completely different lifestyle of calm monastics who don't even have to live the stress of a householder life, let alone that of someone in deployment. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share your thoughts about that storyline as someone who is a veteran, who has trained with the people who serve in the military.
Absolutely, Ted. It should be pretty clear by now, but I am not a believer in that particular storyline. And I think there is a reason why there are millennia of warrior traditions that have existed to train minds and bodies. And they come from all cultures, Eastern, Western. All of them have existed to train warriors to what is called the warrior ethos, which is it's kind of even older than the laws of war. It is the internal capacity to control your emotions and your actions that you need to be able to access even in extreme stress situations. And all the long lineage of martial arts, for example, the long lineages of samurai training, and some of that was actually Buddhist in Japan. All of these lineages existed because they knew that when you have gotten to in extremist situations like war, you're past the place where laws are necessarily going to be applying, and you really have to rely on the internal capacity of the men and women who are facing those situations, that they're still going to be able to access their ethics, to be able to act with wisdom and make choices that are going to lean towards less harm. Modern military training continues to mirror aspects of these older warrior traditions, but I think that there's been an imbalance in them. As I told you, all the warrior traditions focus on building wisdom and courage. Many of the trainings involved for military training in modern cultures have focused very much on the courage side, and they have focused a little bit less on the wisdom side. And you need both of those to access them both. I think much of the modern security environment in the wars that our men and women have been coping with when they have been in Afghanistan and Iraq and some of these other deployments that have happened in the last 20 years, where they're facing population-heavy environments, either counterinsurgency or peacekeeping or even counterterrorism. All of these environments involve asymmetric relationships where the U.S. has been sending in troops with a lot of firepower. They are well-trained. They are very well equipped. And they're usually confronting an adversary that does not have all of that material background. And as a result, the asymmetric strategy has been very, very focused on trying to provoke overreaction on the part of the Americans, because they know that if they can get the Americans to act in a reactive way or in an impulsive way, if they can get them to harm a non-combatant, if they can get them to unnecessarily destroy, some of the village belongings, that is going to turn the local population against them. And to be able to cope with that kind of provocation requires a very strong capacity for impulse control. That is not coming from a place of trying to be a mindful sniper. That is coming from a place of being able to try and minimize harm, not just for the men and women themselves, but for the environment where they're operating. There's a reason why for the last 300 years, there's been such a focus on trying to create laws for war and delineate periods of war and peace with a legal framework, because there's a real understanding that for when men and women operate unethically, they may not feel the harm in that moment of the people that they're affecting or even of themselves, but there is a real correlation downstream, like, over time. Unethical behavior, moral injury is very, very linked to other psychological injuries, to suicidal behavior, to substance use, to violence. Harm pervades. And if you can train people to not access harm, it is both protective of the people that you're working with, but it's also protective for the men and women who are in uniform too.
Thank you for sharing that. Appreciate it. And now the fun book, you told me an interesting story about this book and another. I wonder if you might give us a little bit of a teaser and a little bit of history about the book you just put out.
So Widen the Window was actually initially, like a decade ago, it was part 2 of a different book, but it just became so much that I split them, and Widen the Window has come out first. The other book that will be coming out later, and I'm not going to tell you when because I have learned from my lesson from this time, the timeline often does not match what your thinking brain expects it's going to be. It takes what it takes. But that book is called Techno Blinders, and it looks at some of our blind spots around our use in technology. Initially, the book was very framed in terms of our use with technology for national security. It's, I think, getting broadened to look at how technology gets used for us to feel safe and secure in lots of different realms of our lives, in healthcare, in education, in business, in national security. It's used everywhere. But as I said earlier on in our conversation, technology really helps encourage this anticipatory way of relating to experience where we're always leaning out ahead into the future. It's like a future-oriented anxiety management, we're trying to predict and prevent unwanted things from happening. And when we're too far out ahead that way, when something happens that we don't want, and as humans, inevitably something will happen that we don't want, we really need to have some adaptive capacity to be able to deal with what happens, to adapt, to learn from the experience. And that's where the need for resilience is so important. So Widen the Window and all of the neuroscience research that we did teaching MFIT in high-stress settings was very much to test kind of a wider hypothesis. Can resilience be trained? And indeed it can. I mean, we've seen real shifts, not just in attention and working memory, but we've seen shifts in blood biomarkers and sleep quality, in heart rate and breathing rate, a faster arousal to a higher peak and a much faster recovery back to baseline afterwards. Changes in, through functional magnetic resonance imaging, changes in the way that the brain fires in the regions of the brain that are really important for impulse control, for emotion regulation. So we can train ourselves to be more resilient, even in high stress settings. That's what Widen the Window is laying out. But the initial interest that came to this in how technology kind of often undermines our resilience in some ways, that will be in the next book.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, for those who are listening, I will have a link to more information about Liz and, of course, a link to her book that we've been talking about today. Our guest, Elizabeth Stanley. Liz, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate your time today.
Ted, thank you so much for having me. It was a really fun conversation.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.